Good morning again. It's time for our study of none of these diseases. Once again, using this book that's written by S.I. McMillan back in 1963. We're now in the 5th chapter. This chapter is titled Coronary and Cancer by the Carton. Sure that you can't imagine what it might be about. So we'll just start right into the chapter. It begins with a pretty compelling story. Another one of those, hey, what's going on here? Almost as good as some little novella. There's this plea for help. And the way it comes about is that Dr. McMillan goes into a store, small town kind of dynamics. The grocery store owner says, hey, doctor, I got this note from one of our customers. Her husband is really, really sick. He's very paranoid. And he wants you to come over, and she wants you to come over and find out what's going on with him. He's afraid that he's so sick and he's in such terrible shape that if she left, she may never come back. So he's not even want her to leave the house, can go get groceries, hands off this plea for help note. And she's afraid that he's so paranoid that he might kill her. At least she expresses that. She's also just worried about her health. And so he goes over, makes the proverbial house call that I guess doctors did back in the 60s and not so much anymore. And so when he got there, he looked at him. He knew them. They were patients. He was just a ghost of his former self. He'd been suffering for a very long time. His symptoms were very in line with lung cancer. The doctor called the hospital, set up a time for him to be admitted, and when that time came and he went in, he ended up dying in the hospital on his first night. And the autopsy revealed widespread lung cancer. One would be horrific enough, but he is just one of thousands. Back in 1963, there were 53,000 deaths per year because of lung cancer. That is a huge number. And you can understand why the medical community and everyone else was pretty concerned about it. He gives us a little history of lung cancer, which I wasn't familiar with. It says back in 1912, lung cancer was called the rarest of diseases. You just didn't see it that much. By 1920, there was an increase of the reports of it. By 1950, it had increased in unbelievable rates. Between 24 and 52, in England, it had increased tenfold. In Holland, 20-fold. In New York City, they said they doubled in number. The USA, at least the quote that he gives from medical journals, is that it had increased 500%. That's enough to get your attention back then. What's the cause? Well, we kind of know that answer because we have been warned over the years. We hear about it. We no longer live in those days when everyone smokes a cigarette. You look at some of those old TV shows and old movies. Everybody's smoking. It was commonplace. Everyone was doing it, and everyone was a part of that culture. In 1949, there was the first, at least he says, first medical link between lung cancer and smoking. In 1950, they had a study of 684 patients who had lung cancer. Only 8 of them were non-smokers. So non-smokers can get it too, but a little tiny percentage of it. In England, they did a study of 1,357, only 7 non-smokers. The American Cancer Society did a study of 187,000 back then. It was a 44-month-long study, and the result was conclusive. Smoking leads to lung cancer. That's why when you buy any of those tobacco products, it has that huge warning label from the Surgeon General. Not only is there lung cancer, but there's a lot of other diseases that get associated with it. Cancers and diseases of the larynx, esophagus, gastroulcers, respiratory illnesses, aortic aneurysms, bladder troubles, coronary artery disease, which is a big one, cirrhosis of the liver, strokes, vascular lesions, and he just has a ... It goes on and on and on. And those are a lot of diseases that are, in a lot of ways, at least for the majority, were diseases of choice. He says there are 8 different chemicals found in tobacco that causes cancer whenever it was injected into animals. One of those chemicals was injected into 4,000 mice. You always have to feel sorry for those poor little critters. And every one of them developed cancer. It was just conclusive. He went through a whole section talking about filters are not really helping the change. The chemicals and fluid, it's limiting it in some sense, but it's not changing the impact. People are still getting lung cancer as a result to it. In fact, Surgeon General said there is no method of filtration which demonstrates a reduction in the hazard of lung cancer. Then he gives another late night call, but it was a late night that was, well, medical terms, too late. He gives the physical description of a man who was experiencing severe pain, whom he was called on to help, but by the time he got there, the man had already died. They did a diagnosis, and he had had a heart attack by a large clot of the arteries that was closing off supply to the heart. And then he goes into this section about the American Cancer Society saying that smokers have a 70% higher risk of coronary artery disease. And he talks about, the smoking gun, so to speak, was in this man's pocket. It was a half-smoked pack of cigarettes. You can say that it's very much related. As a sort of a generation removed from all this stuff, we've seen lots of changes. We've seen the decrease in smoking in it. But one of the things that we talk about too is secondhand smoke. So we're saying no more smoking at restaurants, no smoking at airports, lavatories, all the places that people used to gather and congregate and smoke. There's still some establishments where you can, but the other people in that room will inhale that smoke, and it will have a negative impact on their lungs, and it could lead to lung cancer, just as those who were the ones smoking. He talks about the case of a 4-year-old boy in a house with parents that smoked, who was having extreme breathing problems, and their solution was, we've got to take this kid out of this house. And they removed him out, and he got better. And so that was just an anecdotal on his part, just to say, the studies are right. It's just really not good for you. He did say there was some good news for women, that at the time there was a much lower rate of lung disease among women than there were men. And of course, a study of 5,458 women showed that's because there were a lot fewer women smoking back then. So a lot of the lung disease was a male problem because it was primarily those guys who were smoking. Of the women who did smoke, they had a much higher thyroid gland disorder, almost 7 times more frequently than other women. 36% of them had menstrual disturbances. 67% had premature aging. In them, masculinization was more common. Not even sure what masculinization is, but it's something that he talked about. Increase in miscarriages, premature births. He said altogether, just going through this whole section, some 200,000 to 300,000 people per year were dying because of smoking. He says, just to give you a contrast to what the government was stepping in to do at the time, he said in 63 they were doing nothing. They were almost very little. He says, however, there was this news story that broke out that cranberries were being sprayed with a cancer-causing agent, and the government stepped in and prohibited the sales of sprayed cranberries. He says now, when they looked at the studies, you would have to eat 15,000 pounds of cranberries to get enough of the chemical that was used to induce cancer. So he goes, slight chance, still a good thing to do. Government jumped in to do something. But when it came to smoking, they just didn't. Why? Because tobacco was where the money was. There's a $5 million tobacco industry back then, and that was huge. Taxes, profits, donation to political parties, marketing, advertising, all kinds of people were making their living being benefited from the funds produced through that. And And there was the freedom aspect. People were saying, I want to smoke. I want to smoke. But we do know that rest of the story. What happens when the government does step in. Smoking has decreased. It probably took lots of lawsuits. We know there are lots of lawsuits against the tobacco companies who are trying to cover up the connection, at least fight against it, because they don't want to lose their profits. But there's still, lots of people who choose to smoke. And you might ask that question, why do people choose to smoke? I don't know if you ever have smoked, but that first puff is not a pleasant experience. You put it to your lips, you pull it in, you cough, you hack. It's just, there are not any anecdotal stories where someone says, oh man, that is the best thing I've ever had in my entire life. I can't wait to have another one. It becomes what they say is an acquired taste, which means you have to want to do it long enough that now you're okay with that terrible taste. You're okay with it. And it becomes, very seductive. We pick up the habit or the desire to do it because we look around and other people are doing it. At least they were back then. And because they're doing it, you want to be part of that group, part of that crowd. And so you want to do it too. It kind of tells the story about a little 3-year-old girl that was taking slips of paper and putting in her mouth, and the dad is going, what are you doing? And she's going like, well, it's my cigarette. I'm doing what everybody else is doing. I want to be like them. He says, we do look and we do learn. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember going to the little 5 and dime 7-Eleven and seeing the little candy cigarettes or the little gum cigars. I mean, we wanted those things. And the reason we wanted them because we saw everyone else having real ones. These were the candy ones for kids. And we would look forward to that day whenever we could have the real thing. And so it was viewed as a sign of maturity, a sign of adulthood. It was used also as an emblem of rebellion. You can't tell me no. You can tell me no, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so I'm going to do that. It was seen as a sign of sophistication, a sort of a safe way to rebel in society for many people. But once they get started, why do people continue? He says, he got a call from a girl who was desperate and asked him as a doctor, is there any medication you can give me to help me stop? It is addictive. It's addictive psychologically. It's addictive by the chemicals, physiologically. Once you start and you get to a certain point, it becomes the master. And the freedom that you sought in taking those cigarettes or something that takes over, and it becomes the leader. And he had a friend that had stopped. We don't hear stories about people stopping, the process they have to go through to stop. He said, I had to make up my mind. And he said, basically the reason I quit is because smoking became more of a nuisance to me than the benefit I was getting from it. By time people get to that point, it's hard to get rid of it because you've built in all those habits. So he said, I was always looking for matches, always looking for cigarettes, always looking for ashtrays. I was always burning holes in my clothes and my furniture and everything around me. And it finally got to be such a hassle, I just wanted to stop. And that's happened. I'm glad that there has been a huge change of attitudes in our society towards smoking. When I was younger, I smoked. Everybody else was around me smoking. I wanted to smoke. And so I did some. I actually had a friend that came to me and went through a lot of the same kinds of stuff and saying, hey, do you want lung disease? You want this? You want that? You want other? Kind of using what is essentially sort of a scare tactic. At the time, I just wanted to be like my older brothers. I wanted to be like my dad. I wanted to be like the people around me I saw who were smoking. They smoked. Man, I was going to smoke. But fortunately, I didn't go too far into it. By the time I was ready to stop, its hold on me was not as deep as it is on maybe some others. It was still not an easy thing to do, but it was something that I did, and it was a good thing. There's a resurgence of people wanting to smoke now. All of the news about vaping and how evidently it doesn't have the bad effects. And of course, now there's stuff coming out and saying, well, actually there is. You still get those same chemicals, still causing the same kinds of problems. And I'm sure we'll see as this goes down further road that there are complications. It just should be sort of common sense that if you're putting stuff into your lungs that other than the air that we should have, you're going to have problems. And sometimes even with the air we have, because of pollution, because of stuff that's just hanging out, pollens and stuff like that, it's not always the best for us. And so when you add anything with all these vapors, these smokes, it's hard. The resurgence with cigars, especially among young men, is being seen as a sign of being a man, almost like growing a beard, a way to celebrate. Oh, we had a child, or we had this victory, or we had that. Let's smoke a cigar and celebrate. Fortunately, they're not doing it that much, but it's going to have the same impact over a long period of time. The church has always sort of shied away from embracing this manner of living, you might say. He gives the story of a man who was new to Christianity, lived in a country which didn't have people preaching against smoking at the time, like was starting to happen while he was still in his practice. But he felt, this guy that was converted, felt that God was telling him to stop. He thought it was a weird thing for God to ask him to do, but since he thought it was God, he obeyed. And then after he obeyed, he started seeing some of the benefits of not smoking. And then he started looking for scriptures and saying, hey, are there any scriptures that talk about smoking? And even though this book is based on Old Testament primarily, there are no Old Testament don't smoke, because primarily they didn't smoke back then. It's more of a modern issue. However, there's some people who will quote Exodus 20:13, "Thou shalt not kill," because they see smoking as just a slow form of killing yourself or secondhand killing others in that way. You have to stretch it a little bit to get there, but you can. Most people will turn to the New Testament, like in 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, is quoted very often. Usually just a little bit of that. It's a holy temple and don't pollute the holy temple kind of argument. But I want to read the whole of those verses, get a little context. It begins, flee morality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside of the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. And you take that argument and you say smoking is not glorifying God in your body. But there are a couple of things to consider when you bring up a scripture like that. Like, what's the difference between inside and outside sin? I'm not sure what that means. Sexuality or sexual immorality is an inside sin as opposed to an outside sin. Well, what does that mean? He's talking about, well, it's a sin that doesn't just impact the physical body, but it's a sin that impacts what goes on inside of us that makes us who we are. Our mind, our heart, our will, our decisions, everything that are about us. And he says, and he's thinking about this kind of immorality sin, is that when you get involved in that, it's not just about the pleasure of the flesh, it's about the whole of the body, and it pollutes the inside of that person as well as just the body in that. He said, compared to other sins, and there are some sins that are just affect really the body more so than the mind. He said, that's what Paul's saying, so we're going to go with it. I might argue about that. But the body is the temple of God, and so you should treat it better. And that would go for lots of things besides just smoking. That starts going into our eating habits and our drinking habits and our exercise habits. Paul would say that physical exercise profits the body little, but godliness, everything. But at the same time, it does profit a little. And a little is better than none, or in this case, having a negative impact on your physical body. So also, since it's using this whole temple idea, it made me think anyway, it's not in the book. I was like, well, didn't they have smoke, burning incense back in the temple of God? I mean, if you're going to use this as an argument against smoking, and no smoking in the temple. Shouldn't you at least bring that up to discuss? I found a passage in Luke, the first chapter, 9 through 11, that involved burning of incense. Zacharias, which is John the Baptist's father, is going into the Holy of Holies. He's burning incense whenever the angel shows up, and he has that encounter with him, and is told that he's going to have a son. But it probably wasn't burning incense like you and I probably think of. The word used for burning incense all throughout the Old Testament, which is primarily used here in the New Testament as well, is this a word that actually means to kill. That's the root of it, to kill or to sacrifice, the maisai. And it is the idea that what you're burning as a burnt offering is, these animals that they would kill, and they would use the fats and burn them up, and that would be an aroma pleasing to God. And so in that instance, inside the temple, there is smoke that's pleasing to God. So it is a fragrant offering. Still, we don't have the sacrificial system anymore because Jesus is our final sacrifice upon the cross. The old has been set aside, the new has come. And there probably is a little bit of difference between smelling what is essentially the smell of a good barbecue to the smell of a cigarette. As far as I know, barbecue smoke has not yet been linked to lung cancer, but I'm sure like any other smoke, if you inhaled enough of it, it probably would lead that direction as well. I'm just speaking off the top of my head, don't know about that. You'll have to go Google the internet and find out for yourself. Another scripture that people argue with is 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 17. It's another temple argument. Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Holy Spirit dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. Again, Paul's argument is based on these believers who were looking for direction and listening for direction on how to live their lives. And unfortunately, these particular people were not listening to Paul, but they were listening to other leaders in the church, and these other leaders were basically saying, yeah, it's okay to go be involved in that act of immorality or this particular thing. And that's really okay. And Paul's saying, no, guys, it's not okay to do those things. Those are known things that God says don't do. You're polluting the temple with those things. So don't do that. He even goes so far as saying that each man's work will be tested by the fire of God. And by work, it's these things that you're doing or bringing into your life. And he says that what some people are doing are going to get burned up, but the person will still be saved. And for the other people, the things that they bring in their life are going to stand that test. And both it and they will be before the Lord. With all that said, this whole idea about not destroying the temple made me think about Jesus. And Jesus was always telling the Pharisees, hey, I'm going to tear down this temple in 3 days, rebuild it. And it really ticked them off. They didn't want to hear about anything happening to the temple of God. But we know that that's exactly what Jesus did. He destroyed in 3 days the purpose of the temple. Now, the building still stands, but the sacrifice was made on the cross. He completely fulfilled that, and in 3 days, he had built a new temple, a new kingdom in which we worship him, and so we're going to him alone, and we don't even need to bother with this whole smoking argument, and because we do become the temple, we want to be careful in what we bring into our lives, that we don't try to get away with bringing sin into our lives, whatever that looks like, and trying to make it okay in the house of God. It'd be like someone bringing stuff into your own home that you don't like. And they're going like, yeah, it's really okay. We'll just bring it in here for a little bit. And you're like, no, not in my house. You get rid of that stuff. You can stay, but not that junk. And it's sort of the same way in God's house. Other people will go to also another 1 Corinthians passage chapter 10, 28 to 31. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. I mean, not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Whether, then, you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all in the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. I have heard a lot of people who basically say, well, as long as I'm given thanks for it, then it's okay. But what Paul is talking about is that these things that they're giving thanks for are things that are okay with God to start with. It's just that another person doesn't like it. God's okay with it, but the person's not okay with it. They're saying, hey, I'm giving thanks to God about this, and so it's really okay. But it's not the same whenever God's not okay with it. And so this passage is about that dynamic between not making a brother stumble and your own conscience sake about what you're doing in your relationship to God. Matthew 15, 10 to 16 is also another one that people will bring up in this argument against smoking. After Jesus called the crowd to him, he said to them, hear and understand. It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth. This defiles the man. Then the disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard that statement? But he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father did not plant shall be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if a blind man guides a blind man, they're both going to fall into the pit. Context is hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They made this big deal about being clean on the outside and make sure everything is good on the outside. But on the inside of them, they were polluted. They were liars. They were cheaters. They berated others. They had no compassion on the inside. And so they weren't doing any of those outside sins, but they had plenty of inside sins going on. And so their temples were polluted, even though they were pretty good on the outside stuff. And so this context of that passage is basically saying, yes, it's more, you got to have the inside right. But that doesn't mean we can just, whack at the outside as well. We need to be stewards of the body that God has given us. It is that temple that we need to take care of. In that. Others will also look at Matthew 4:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one, love the other. He will be devoted to one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, it is talking about greed. It's talking about wealth. It's talking about addiction. And so you have to move from that passage and say, well, there's anything else that we're addicted to. Would this be substances that we could be addicted to that become masters of our lives, that control us in a way that moves us further from God, pollutes the inside as well as the outside, that inner man as well as that physical man, and pulls us from God? You have to say, yeah, you can make that argument in as well. And so, with all of those things said, the scriptures don't say don't smoke. However, if you don't want to get lung cancer, don't smoke. It's really not a good, healthy choice. There are lots of better choices that we can make, but you have to make your own argument in this. There's lots of times throughout the history of the church that people gather on the outside, or they step outside, they smoke their cigarette, and then they come inside. There's a part of me that says, hey, I'd rather have them here, even if they're going to smoke on the outside of the church, than have them not here at all. And so you kind of get into that whole thing. Personally, I just like to see people set it down. It is pretty harmful, and people are still going to choose to do it. But God does tell us that we can always make better choices for ourselves. And when we make better choices, our choices will not lead to the diseases that everyone else is experiencing. So that's our lesson for the day. Hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. God bless.